Bonjour, Mr. Wednong, Nine Indigenous Kwadorem, Ganamjing Donjaba. My name is Quinn Meawasige from Surtmer First Nation. Um, my community is a signatory to the Robinson-Huron Treaty of 1850, and we're located along the north shore of Lake Huron. And I'm also a member of the Bear Clan. But my program, we'll say CSD for short, it really takes an approach of community development, where it's often looked as just as economic development and how can you promote community wellness, community development, um, within the community. And so we bring the social aspect where how could we use economic development? How can we bring in the social? How could we improve the standard of living, the quality of life within our community, through fostering healthy relationships, and essentially building community. So really having a community-driven process. Anything that's done, whereas a lot of things that are done are really top-down. So how do you have a process, strategies, goals, objectives that are um, identified by the community and essentially driven by the community. So um, it's a pretty cool program. I love the program. It's great. And so Anishinaabemowin certificate that I'm taking, um, they do offer a degree, but I'm taking the certificate, and so it's essentially Anishinaabemowin is language, and it's great. It's really providing me with a foundation to pursue fluency. I recognize by taking the course itself, I won't become fluent by taking the course. So I think why that's important to understand is that, at first I thought, well, I'd become fluent after taking the course, but then really realizing how much, learning a language, how much, what it really takes. So, and a lot of it's actually learning grammar. I had to relearn some English terms, like for instance, what are intransitive verbs? You know what I mean? So, but it's really providing you with the tools necessary to understand the structure of language. And so actually this spring we're having an opportunity to pursue some uh, immersion setting teaching, which is important because that's really necessary in order to become language proficient. Well, I think for one, you have to really understand like the institution. So the institution, Algoma University, sits on the site of the former Shingwauk Residential School, and so they're really committed to uh, implementing the calls to action for the Truth and Reconciliation Commission. They have a really solid commitment to cross-cultural learning and education, as well as reconciliation. So that's right directly within their strategic plan, which was just approved, the 5-year strategic plan. And so the institution itself is trying to foster that type of learning on campus, within the programs that they develop. Shingwauk Kinoomaage Gamig was really founded on the vision of Shingwauk Kinoomaage, who had a vision of, a teaching lodge where, his people would be able to be grounded in, their Anishinaabe identity, still being able to learn who they are, practice who they are, but also learning the tools of Western society. So to be able to, be strong Anishinaabe people that are also, educated in within the Western world and being able to, contribute to both. So with that very unique and strong vision, that's being realized through some of the work that Shingwauk Kinoomaage Gamig is doing. So um, I think it's really good because it's really looking at, well, what does education look like? What does Indigenous education look like? So these conversations are happening, and within academia, you see a lot of writers writing about it, but are they actually doing it? So it's really cool to see how their approach to Indigenous education and taking it out of the classroom at times, right? Which is sometimes for Western academia, it's like, well, it's often viewed as alternative education, right? But we know education and we have our own understanding of what education is. And so I think through Shingwauk Kinoomaage Gamig is just fully realizing that. which is really exciting. It's an exciting time. I'm in a Western academia, right? I'm pursuing a post-secondary, education through, Western academic institution. So, and that's really what I'm struggling with is, what does Indigenous studies look like within Western academic institutions? And what I've been struggling with is what happens when you bring Indigenous knowledge systems within Western academia. And so what happens is when we try to bring them together to cross over at that interface where they meet, you know, can Indigenous knowledge systems and knowledge be whole within Western academia? Or do they have to seek validation through, Western academia? And what does that do to the integrity of the knowledge or the knowledge system? So that's just something that we have to be really aware of in terms of, like, if we're going to, uh, you know, understand what Indigenous education is, you know, it's we have to have the worldview, these values. We have to bring, our customs into what education looks like, and language is really important as well. So I'll give an example. I had class, and there's an elder, a knowledge holder, who came in to Bawating, which is Sault Ste. Marie, and was sharing the creation story. Anishinaabe creation story. So this is like education, Atsokanik, the sacred stories, these sacred legends. And, I had to skip class, right? Be marked as absent, not really be punished, but like just the fact that having to choose between going to class or actually having an opportunity to go to, the creation story being told. And so, would I get credit for, going to learn about the creation stories? The same thing. Someone was actually in the language was telling Nana Bojo stories, legends, and so I skipped class. I was gone class for a whole week. Just because knowledge keepers were there telling stories. Is that knowledge seen as credible? Is it seen valid through the eyes of Western academia? Does it seem to hold any value? And so when we look at Indigenous education, how do we bring in, these concepts, these ideas, Anishinaabe and Dendamo and Anishinaabe thought, into education? Now, I think what's happening is, we might create something that mirrors Western academia, um, put an Indigenous name on it, and then call it our own. But it's still it's still operating within the framework of Western academia, following certain criteria of validation. And so, is it fully, truly, wholly, um, with all of its integrity, Indigenous education? So that's what I'm struggling with, but that's what's exciting, is because more of our thinkers, our Anishinaabe peoples, are starting to really understand what this looks like and are challenging it and are recreating Indigenous education through, whether it's institutions, through different programs, removing them from, the classroom, instilling any type of content or anything that we do with Indigenous values, customs, and worldview. So um, I think that's really important, because if we're teaching, and I don't want to discredit any of the work that's been done before us, because it really paved the way, for a lot of this to happen. Like, some of our thinkers now don't have that, wouldn't have had that now if it wasn't for the result of, those who came before us and paved the way. So I have to really acknowledge them, who I can imagine having to navigate the Western institutions before us. Like, they were really breaking ground. So, but I think people always talk about our knowledge is directly tied to the land, to our sacred stories, and to our language, right? So the idea of Indigenous pedagogy or lands-based knowledge, um, are we, you know, by having Indigenous education within institutions, are we conforming, or, and are we trying to really fully realize what education is for Indigenous peoples? So it's really challenging. Like, I have always really struggled with, well, the concept of the two-row wampum belt, where, the idea of Indigenous peoples are in one canoe and Western people society are in another canoe, and they're traveling parallel together in the same river, you know. Um, and so we're both steering our own boat. We get to determine what, we have our self-determination, for our future. And so that's what we need to do, is because we have an inherent right to assert our right, our birthright to educate our peoples, right? And so um, I think we just have to realize that. I think Indigenous is a word for, I don't identify as Indigenous. I think Indigenous is a term that's used by governments, by, settler society. I identify as Anishinaabe. That's Anishinaabe and Dao. That's who I am. I'm Ojibwe. My ancestors are Ojibwe, Anishinaabe, and so I wouldn't call my relatives Indigenous. I'd call them Anishinaabe. Um, my relatives who are Haudenosaunee, I would call them Haudenosaunee, not Indigenous. So if you think about how many really distinct um, people there are, uh, you know, on Turtle Island, they each have their different languages. They have their own customs. They have, their own names through which they identify. So Indigenous is more like a kind of a pan Indigenous approach, where you're able to identify, um, who Indigenous peoples are, but I think really respecting, really, really, truly who they are is by acknowledging that, we're very diverse. I've been around the fire, the sacred fire, even fires in general, and the knowledge that's shared there. Um, that knowledge that's passed down, through stories, these knowledge through customs, through practice. Um, to me, you won't find that within, an institution. You might read about it, but to actually experience it, what's experiential knowledge? Like the academia will call it experiential knowledge, place-based learning, right? Mm-hmm. Lands-based education. It's really being present within and understanding, that there's a difference between education within institutions, and then there's education, that you experience by doing. Um, and there's this one word I heard. It was Kinowabi, and that means like to learn by observing, right? He or she learns by observing. And I'm pretty sure that's what it is, and that's really important because I think the way we learn and how knowledge transfer happens is by being present, right? So you can read about it. How connected are you to you by reading about it? So that's the same thing with lands-based knowledge. You can read about lands-based knowledge, or you can actually be there and be a part of it. Actually doing it. So I think Indigenous education is, grounded in our worldview, our customs, even language. I know others, actually thinkers like Stanley Palche, who are really strong in, like, Indigenous knowledge is in the language. We can't translate certain things in our language into English because it does no justice, right? So certain concepts in our language, it really can't be translated into English. So I aspire to one day to be able to understand what that truly means. Have an idea, but to really fully grasp it. That will be a part of my education journey, and that's Anishinaabe education. So when I think about like the creation stories that I went to, the Anishinaabe Atsakonic, like those sacred legends, Nanabush stories, to me that's education. The values you learn there of how to interact with one another, of how to be a human being, how to be an Anishinaabe, how to carry and conduct yourself, like that's also education. But would a Western institution see that as education? And so that's where there's a clash. But there's value in being present within Western academic institutions. what's happened in the past is you have non-Indigenous peoples writing about Indigenous peoples without us, right? So we have to be present in order to actually to the knowledge that's written in these institutions are done by us, not about us without us. So there's so much value of, we still have to be present within Western institutions, but I think that eventually there'll come a point where we have to really determine what education looks like in our communities for our people, and I think that's part of the conversation. That's people are theorizing, people are writing about, our thinkers are really working on, and so maybe part of this research, that's what maybe something that might be, right? So as a young person who works with youth, I find that a lot of Indigenous youth don't have that connection to who they are. They don't know or have the experience or even the exposure or opportunity to learn who they are. They're removed from that, and so we have young people growing up not knowing who they are, not being proud of who they are, being ashamed. I was, until I started to learn about who I was. So if they had an opportunity to learn about who they were, and all the great things that we bring and offer to the world, can that bring them pride? Can that help them throughout their life? Can that grounding be very influential in you know in terms of helping a young person find direction in life, right? So I think so. That's what I hear from young people all around, is that I just want an opportunity to know who I am, because I don't get the opportunity within Western education. The role that our families had in educating, our young people is so important, and a lot of, as a result of colonization, residential schools, even just the history of Indian policy, you know, it really broke apart our family structures. It really broke apart our ability to raise our young people, to raise our children to be strong people. And so someone once asked me, like, how do we rebuild our nations? How do we build strong nations? I said, well, we gotta start with ourselves, right? But then we gotta rebuild our family structures. Healthy families, healthy individuals, healthy families can contribute to healthy communities. Rebuilding communities, healthy communities is how we will build healthy nations, right? So I don't know. I think that's really important, and we gotta start there as well. But currently within let's say K to 12, what Western society, non-Indigenous peoples also have to learn about the history. They also have to be aware of the injustices done to Indigenous peoples. But how can they be proactive? How can they help? How can they play a role into supporting Indigenous peoples? And so, like, I didn't learn about the history in elementary school, and that needs to be there. Same with high school, that needs to be present. And going to post-secondary, I think there's Indigenous educational institutions that are getting their own ability, and that's the thing, they're getting the permission to grant their own degrees, right? So should they seek permission, or should they just do it? You know what I mean? And so should they develop, and it's very important. We need to learn numbers. We need to know, accounting. We got to learn how to, build. We have to learn, all these tools. So how is it done? What way is it approached? I think is very important. And we're missing out on an opportunity to educate not only our own people but the rest of society. Because if we're traveling in this boat together, one canoe and another, and we're traveling in this river together, we got to respect one another. We have to support one another as well. So we got to coexist, peacefully, respectfully with one another as well. So there's got to be a relationship. Relationship has been damaged in the past. It can still be damaged today. So I guess it's rebuilding that relationship and supporting each other forward, because we can't be doing the only heavy lifting as Indigenous peoples. We're recovering, we're healing from this history, from this past. And so is it on us to do the educating, or is it also on Western society, it's the state, it's institutions, to be a part of doing that heavy lifting as well? I asked myself one day, while I am here, Western institutions will always be here. I can always get my degree. Academia is not going anywhere. But our elders, our knowledge holders, our fluent language speakers are only here for so much longer, right? So I've heard the term, or just I've heard this before, is that when one of our elders, our knowledge keepers, language speakers pass away, it's like the equivalent to a library burning down. You know what I mean? So do I take advantage of the opportunity where our language, our knowledge keepers are here, are present, have these stories, have this knowledge now, and maybe go and pursue my graduate studies 20 years later, right? Because it's going to be here, it's not going anywhere, but our elders won't be. So that's a realization that I'm really struggling with, because the pressure is to post-secondary Western education, right? So, but there's value, so much value in our knowledge, but there's also a lot of value in being equipped with the tools of Western society. So balance. If we develop a process, or when we develop a process, a framework. I hate even the idea of calling it frameworks, right? But we have to be able to just assert it, and for the government to recognize, this is our inherent right. This is our primordial rights. This is something that we've never surrendered, the right to educate our people, and we understand it as legitimate, as valid. And so what needs to happen is space needs to be made to recognize that, right? And so Western institutions can make space for that, right? They can be really influential and supporting that as well.